We asked both Paul and Bob to be here today because a lot of the press, as well as our elected officials, have heard from Nebraska landowners. And it was important for us to get across that the threats over eminent domain, kind of the either empty promises or questions unanswered, happen in other states as well. That this is a trend, that this is not just kind of isolated here in Nebraska. We also have somebody who actually witnessed kind of the 6-story leak, spill, burst on Keystone 1 at the transmission site, at the pumping station. So I'm going to turn it over to you guys to give a little bit more background on yourselves, and then we'll open it up for questions.
Hi, I'm Paul Matthews from Coxville, North Dakota. The recent Keystone link in North Dakota happened in our district. Both Bob and I are emergency response firemen in our area, and I'll probably deflect the Bob's recollection of the day about that and emergency response on that. I'm a landowner whose the corridor does go through my property. The original plans for Keystone placed the center line of the pipeline 156 feet away from my home. That began a process of trying to learn about the pipeline, and it continues to this day, and it was very good for me to hear Mr. Swift talk about the risks associated with that, which matches my research too over the past several months. For county officials, I think it's important to know that some things that happened. Our particular county had a haulers agreement, and these are heavy trucks, a lot of traffic. And in our particular case, it was a county road that went past our home down to the pumping plant. So there was about 11 miles of truck traffic. The road did not take it very well. In fact, even today, 3 years later, I think a case could be made that some of the destruction of the heavy truck traffic has literally destroyed the road. And it's not probably entirely their fault. We've had a wet years. In fact, they were fortunate to do it when they did, because it's beyond our imagination how they could install it now. But when we think about that time period of all this truck traffic, they recognized the roads were getting roughed up, and they were becoming unpassable even for their equipment. Even though those hauler agreements were there, they would seek out their own way of getting there, and that probably wasn't on the designated roads. Now that may not have been necessarily Keystone's responsibility, but maybe their installer. But I'm sure they were under pressure to get it in and get it done. No matter how you could get it done, do it. So we could see other roads being affected by the same construction problems. Bob, why don't you go ahead and talk about the spill at this point?
My name is Bob Van Der Ett. As has been said, I'm a rancher from southeastern North Dakota, and I have 2 miles of Keystone 1 pipeline running across our property. I live 1.5 miles from the pumping station in North Dakota that had the 20,000 gallon spill back on May 7th. And I'm also the eyewitness that called that spill into TransCanada. And I guess my reason for being here today is I'd like the public and officials that are siting and okaying these pipelines to know really how well these leak detection systems work. We have TransCanada telling us how good the system works. I guess I'm here today to say that their version of how it worked in the North Dakota spill is somewhat different than what I witnessed and what I saw. I guess I'd like to touch on the cleanup response time that Paul mentioned too. The pumping station that's located by me is 2 hours from the closest cleanup, 2 hours from the closest station cleanup crew that have cleanup equipment. Now after the spill was called in that day, a single technician was sent out. Took about 2.5 hours for him to get there to confirm the spill. And now that's after an eyewitness has already said that there was oil shooting 60 feet in the air. I would have thought that that maybe was confirmation enough, but they sent out the single person after he was there, and seemingly after a little pressure from the North Dakota Health Department, the cleanup crews were called, and again, they're stationed 2 hours away, so the first cleanup trailer arrived 5 hours after the spill was reported. To me, that's not adequate, and I guess that's up to you know, the Nebraskans to decide if that's good enough for Nebraska. That's all I have. If there's any questions.
I have a question. The ground that this spill went on, is it heavy soil or sand? Or?
It's sandy soil, almost like out in the sandhills of Nebraska. It's very sandy.
The reason I'm asking is, if you went in the sandhills of Nebraska today with any heavy equipment, you'd fall into the, and I have a brother-in-law, a son-in-law that's on the fire department in the Sandhill area, and they had a grass fire up there. It took them 15 hours to get this grass fire, and they fell in the sand to the point where they broke an axle in the fire truck. And if there was methane or anything in that, and there was a fire, they'd burn thousands of acres of.
Yeah?
Mr. Bendrett, are you in a position to say how long it was after you first witnessed the geyser of oil that it stopped?
After we saw it, after we first saw it, until it actually stopped shooting up high enough so that I could see it from 1.5 miles away. I'm sure it went down and maybe trickled out some more. But after we first saw it, until it stopped shooting up in the air, was 30 minutes.
You're aware that they claim that they already knew there was a problem before you called them.
Oh yes,
Are you satisfied that is the case?
No, I'm not. No, I'm not.
Can you just describe, I mean, what were you doing? Were you outside? Did you hear something? How did you notice this thing? And what exactly did it look like 1.5 miles away?
Back in May, we were just finishing up calving, so that's probably why I was out there so early in the morning. And walking out my door to the shop, when I walked that way, the pumping station is right there 1.5 miles away. So I mean, it's just, and I guess you just look up, you look at it every morning. It's there, and here's a geyser of oil. That's the best way to describe it, shooting up in the air. And like I said, at the reports at that time, it was over the tops of the cottonwood trees. So, it's at 60, 80 feet. It was up there, and I guess looking back at it now, the part that surprises me is that I didn't look at it and say, gosh, what's that? I wonder what that is. You knew what it was. You knew it was oil shooting up. Kind of just like in the movies where, they hit a geyser and up she goes. And we were very, very fortunate that morning that it was perfectly still. So the oil was pretty much up and came back down, and most of it was contained in their containment berm. If there had been a 30-mile-an-hour wind like there was 24 hours later, how much of that oil would have gotten out into the surrounding land. And as Paul mentioned earlier, we have been so wet up there, especially this spring. There was ponded water everywhere, and that oil gets into that water, and as Mr. Swift said, if that settles out, their main focus on this containment seems to be the booms on top of the water to skim off of the top. But if it's already settled out, down into the bottom, and I'm not sure that was addressed in our situation. I think it was everything, as far as we know, everything was just skimmed. And that was part of my point about the 5-hour response time. If this stuff is spreading out in the water and settling down, is 5 hours good enough?
I got another question to ask you. Have you got sand points in your sand where you pump water?
Some.
Yep.
Because I called them, and I'm close to this line, I'm not. But I said, if that gets into my water supply, it'll plug my sand points like that. Oh, don't worry, we'll be out and clean them. I said, every day? And they said, oh, you bet. And because if oil gets on a sand point, it's plugged right now. Water won't go through it. And so I'm wondering if you have a problem up there besides, from my understandings of the material that's coming down that pipeline from that Indians that's getting poisoned up there, that it's got hydrocarbons. They told me it had hydrocarbons in it. Well, I looked up hydrocarbons, that's benzene and methane. Plus, they said that the doctor that they run out of Alberta and went to Nova Scotia said that there was mercury and what's the other poison? Arsenic in his findings. So I'm just asking questions. That's all I'm doing.
You asked a lot of the same questions we did.
Okay.